Welcome back. Another dire warning for Australia. Firefighters there trying to contain dozens of bushfires right across the east coast of the country. Now, officials say catastrophic fire danger is expected later this week. Already thousands of people have been told to evacuate as the blazes spread. 3 people have been killed, dozens of people injured, including many firefighters, and several people are listed as missing. On Monday, at least 43 schools will remain closed. And here's a look at how emergency teams are trying to put out the flames. Firefighters in Australia drive through what looks like an inferno. Smoke and flames surround the vehicle. There's not much here that can be saved. More than 1,000 firefighters are battling a record number of high-intensity blazes across New South Wales. Authorities say this is one of the worst bushfire seasons they've seen.
Unfortunately, we are in uncharted territory. We've never seen this many fires concurrently at emergency warning alert level.
Officials say high winds are fanning the fires, making them extremely dangerous, even creating their own weather conditions, like fire clouds, which can blow embers kilometres away. Towns have been evacuated and people are being warned to leave early rather than risk being trapped by the volatile flames.
My car's packed, ready to go. I'll make a judgment call. I might be out of here in 10 minutes. I might be out of here in half an hour. I'm not sure.
The fires have also taken a deadly toll on wildlife. Experts estimate that half of the koalas at a protected koala habitat have died.
It was a really hot, high-intensity fire and really just left not very much alive in its path. We managed to salvage 10 koalas from this particular fire ground.
Let's take a closer look at this with David Wallace-Webbs in New York. He's the author of The Uninhabitable Earth. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So the dire assessment from firefighters there in Australia is catastrophic conditions expected in the coming days. Already, from the pictures we're seeing, they look to be catastrophic. Why do you think Australia should care more about climate change than most countries?
Well, it's an unusual situation in that most of the most intense impacts of climate change are coming first in the global south. It's a sort of unfortunate fact, but the countries in the world that have done the least to produce global warming are going to be hit hardest by its impacts. But Australia is sort of the one big exception to that because of the accident of geography. It's a relatively wealthy nation that is also already suffering intensely from climate change impacts, which means it's a sort of a test case for how the first world will respond to quite dramatic levels of warming. And to this point, they're not responding all that well. They just earlier this year, re-elected their prime minister, who ran his campaign, practically speaking, on a climate skepticism platform. It was a campaign that was dominated by discussion of climate change, and the Liberal challenger was really focused on addressing carbon emissions and taking dramatic action. And in fact, the Conservative incumbent won on the basis of saying that it would be too expensive to take action against some of these impacts. But when you look at these fires, for instance, but also the drought that precedes them and helped create them, you see that this is a country that is already dealing with quite dramatic, difficult conditions thanks to climate change today, when we're at just 1.1 degrees of warming. And over the next decade or two, as we get to 2 or 3 degrees of warming, we're going to have much more intense impacts still. And the government is not yet taking any kind of meaningful action to combat those impacts or to alleviate some of the emissions that will make it worse in the long run.
Absolutely. And I want to look a little bit more at that political response, because the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and his government have been accused, as you say, not doing enough to combat climate change. He actually green-lighted the controversial Adani coal mine, even bringing a piece of coal into Parliament, saying no one should be scared of it. Australia, of course, was banned from the recent United Nations climate conference due to its inaction. Yet Mr. Morrison said this at the United Nations General Assembly. Take a listen.
Australia's internal, though, and global critics on climate change willingly overlook or perhaps ignore our achievements, as the facts simply don't fit the narrative they wish to project about our contribution. Australia is responsible for just 1.3% of global emissions. Australia is doing our bit on climate change, and we reject any suggestion to the contrary.
Well, just in the last few days since those fires broke out, Mr. Morrison again sidestepped a question from a reporter asking if these fires are indeed related to climate change. He said his thoughts are only with those who lost their lives and their loved ones. How dangerous is his attitude that he doesn't actually want to tackle the problem?
Well, I think it's dangerous on two levels. The first is simply as a measure of Australia's emissions. He's correct that they're responsible for only, I think the number is actually a little bit higher than the figure he cites, but a tiny sliver, maybe 2% of global emissions. But that's really a result of the scale of and the size of the nation, not because they're doing such a good job on emissions. But their emissions are scheduled to grow over the next couple of decades, in part because they're not just burning coal themselves, but exporting coal to other parts of Southeast Asia. And if you account for that, I think the figures are that over the next couple of decades, Australia's slice of the global emissions pie will grow to be about 13%, which isn't meaningfully smaller than the United States is at the moment. But secondly, it illustrates a big problem with the global challenge of addressing climate change in the sense that very few nations of the world are responsible for a big enough slice of emissions that if they take action themselves, they will see the results within their own borders. China is responsible for about 30% of global emissions, the US for about 15%, India for about 7%. Beyond those nations, almost no country is responsible for more than 2 or 3% of emissions, which means their work, their good work, it only matters if the rest of the world follows as well. Individual nations acting on their own, even moving very aggressively to decarbonize, won't meaningfully impact the big picture, the large-scale level of emissions that we're producing as a planet, which means I think we need some kind of more focused and systemic, concrete, collaborative framework that will organize all of the nations of the world to take action so that individual leaders like Scott Morrison, but also like Jair Bolsonaro, and for that matter, Donald Trump, won't have an excuse for inaction for saying, well, my country is only responsible for 1 or even 10 or 15% of emissions. If every leader in the nation can say that, which practically speaking today they can, that means that the project of organizing global action will be much, much harder.
Absolutely. I want to talk about, David, the generational divide on this issue of climate change. Because you probably will have noticed that young New Zealand lawmaker who went viral for her quick retort to a heckler during a session of Parliament, 25-year-old Chloe Swarbrick, was giving a speech supporting a climate crisis bill when an older member of Parliament butted in, and she quickly shut him down. Just take a listen.
In the year 2050, I will be 56 years old. Yet, right now, the average age of this 52nd Parliament is 49 years old. Okay, Boomer. Current political institutions have proven themselves incompetent of thinking outside of a short political term.
Okay, Boomer. That, of course, became an internet rallying cry for millennials fed up with the older generation, the so-called baby boomer generation, who they blame for not doing enough to tackle this. Clearly, it is a bit of an inconvenient truth for the older generation, for a large part, that in the short term, it's going to cost money and innovation and time and effort to deal with this.
Well, the truth is that the economic profession these days now sees things in a quite rosy way. They say, unlike the view they had just a few years ago, that fast action on climate will be better for almost everyone, that we could add tens of trillions of dollars to the global economy if we decarbonize more rapidly, even over the next decade or two. That is very different from the conventional wisdom that held in the economics profession up until, say, 5 years ago. And I think the fact that economists used to see it as quite expensive to take action is one reason we've had so little policy and political change and focus on this issue over the last generation. But that really is changing. And I think it's one reason why we're beginning to see the politics change as well. But of course, it's still playing out very much along the generational divide that you're describing. Perhaps the clearest illustration of that is the school strikes, the global school strikes, which have been led by teenagers, especially Greta Thunberg, but others around the world, who see in very clear terms the costs of global inaction on climate change. But we're starting to see it in our politics as well, where leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US or Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand are taking a much more aggressive line on climate change than leaders of earlier generations. And I think that's in part because the science is becoming clearer. It's in part because the logic of economics is becoming clearer. But it's also simply because they're going to be around longer, and they understand that something that's going to happen in 2040 or 2050 or 2060 is not so far away that we shouldn't be planning for it. That's the amount of time that, you know, an American mortgage holds, 30 years. I just had a daughter this last year. She'll be thinking of having children her own in 2050. So these are not dates that are so far away we shouldn't plan for them. They're close enough that we really need to be organizing our policy around climate challenges, immediately. Absolutely.
David Wallace-Webbs, author of The Uninhabitable Earth. Congratulations on the birth of your daughter, and thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, for more incredible images out of Australia we're seeing of those bushfires, you can head over to CNN.com. There you can see more on how emergency teams are fighting to put out those flames. Well, protests in Iraq show no signs of ending. Coming up, we'll show you the unsung heroes of the violent protests, the humble tuk-tuk. We're going to go live to Baghdad when we return.